The world has always had its share of storms, not just of weather, but of politics, war, and human desperation. When nations collapse, when empires crumble, and when people cry out for order in the face of chaos, history shows us a chilling truth. The most ruthless often rise the fastest. In the shattered streets of post-war cities, in the hunger lines of broken economies, and in the power vacuums left behind by fallen rulers, certain men saw not tragedy, but opportunity. They promised rebirth, stability, and strength. Yet what they delivered was something far more complex, regimes built on fear, blood, and unyielding control. From the revolutionary fires of Russia to the ruins of Germany, from the battlefields of China to the ashes of Spain, these leaders emerged not as saviors, but as architects of new orders forged through iron will and merciless tactics. Their ruthlessness was not a flaw to be hidden. It was their greatest weapon, and it defined the eras they ruled. This is the story of 7 ruthless leaders who rose from chaos, men whose names are forever etched in the history books, not just for the nations they shaped, but for the warning they leave behind. In the wake of collapse, power belongs to those willing to take it at any cost. Russia in 1917 was a nation on the edge of collapse. World War I had drained its armies, starved its people, and broken faith in the Tsarist regime. Soldiers deserted by the thousands. Cities swelled with angry workers demanding bread and peace. Out of this turmoil emerged a man who not only embraced the chaos, he weaponized it. Vladimir Lenin returned from exile with a radical vision, a society without czars, aristocrats, or capitalists. He promised peace, land, and bread, simple words that struck like lightning in a country weary of war. But behind those promises was a ruthless drive for power. Lenin knew that revolutions are not won by kindness. They are won by seizing control, silencing enemies, and never hesitating. Through the October Revolution, Lenin's Bolsheviks toppled a fragile provisional government and seized the Russian state. When resistance followed, he unleashed the Red Terror, a campaign of executions, arrests, and secret police surveillance that crushed opposition with fear. The Cheka, his dreaded security force, became the iron fist of the revolution. For Lenin, mercy was weakness. He believed that building a workers' utopia required purging anyone who stood in the way. His policies created a one-party dictatorship that silenced dissent, yet they also laid the foundations of the Soviet Union, a state that would dominate world affairs for decades. Lenin rose from chaos not by calming the storm, but by steering it. He transformed a crumbling empire into a revolutionary state, proving that in times of collapse, the most ruthless visionaries can become the architects of new worlds. Germany in 1919 was a nation humiliated, defeated in World War I, forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and crushed under the weight of reparations. The German people lived with bitterness and despair. Inflation devoured savings, jobs vanished, and veterans wandered the streets broken and forgotten. Out of this humiliation rose a man who promised to restore pride, but whose ruthless path would plunge the world into darkness. Adolf Hitler was no soldier king or aristocrat. He was a failed artist, a restless drifter who found purpose in rage. After joining the Nazi Party, he discovered the power of words. Fiery speeches that turned anger into loyalty, hatred into unity. He pointed to enemies both real and imagined, communists, Jews, traitors, foreign powers. To the desperate, his scapegoats offered clarity. To the broken, his promises of strength offered hope. When his first grab for power, the 1923 beer hall putsch, failed, Hitler learned a lesson. Ruthlessness wasn't just violence, it was patience. He used prison time to write Mein Kampf, refining his vision. Over the next decade, he transformed the Nazis from a fringe movement into a political machine fueled by propaganda, fear, and paramilitary intimidation. By 1933, Hitler had maneuvered his way into the chancellorship. Once inside the halls of power, he struck without hesitation. Political rivals were jailed or killed, freedoms dissolved, and soon Germany became a one-party dictatorship. Ruthlessness defined every stage of his rule, from the persecution of Jews to the launch of a war that killed tens of millions. Hitler rose from the wreckage of Germany's defeat by turning despair into fanaticism. His story is a warning. In times of humiliation and chaos, the promise of pride can become the deadliest weapon of all. After World War I, Italy stood victorious, but broken. The nation had bled on the battlefield, only to be betrayed at the peace table. Veterans returned to a land of soaring unemployment, bitter strikes, and violent protests. Democracy looked weak. Disorder reigned. Out of this turmoil stepped a man who promised to restore Italy's glory, not with compromise but with fists, fear, and fire. Benito Mussolini, once a socialist agitator, reinvented himself as the prophet of a new creed, fascism. Where others saw chaos, Mussolini saw opportunity. He recruited bands of war veterans and disillusioned youth, forming the Black Shirts, squads that beat, intimidated, and silenced political enemies. They didn't argue with opponents. They crushed them. In 1922, Mussolini staged his famous March on Rome, a carefully calculated show of power. The government, paralyzed and afraid, handed him authority rather than risk civil war. It was a bloodless coup, but only because Mussolini's ruthlessness left no real choice. Once in power, he dismantled Italy's fragile democracy. Newspapers were censored, unions were destroyed, and opposition leaders were jailed or killed. His regime glorified violence, cultivated fear, and promised a reborn Roman Empire under his iron rule. To Mussolini, politics was not debate, it was war. Though eventually overshadowed by Hitler, Mussolini was the blueprint. He showed how chaos could be harnessed into dictatorship, how propaganda could seduce a nation, and how ruthlessness could become the foundation of a state. From the ashes of war, Mussolini proved that weakness invites strong men, and in Italy's darkest moment, he rose as the man who promised order and delivered tyranny. When Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, the future of the Soviet Union was uncertain. Would it be Trotsky, the fiery revolutionary general, or another Bolshevik intellectual? Few suspected that the quiet, calculating man from Georgia, Joseph Stalin, would rise above them all. Yet Stalin's genius was not brilliance in ideas, but brilliance in ruthlessness. He understood that in a revolution built on chaos, survival meant eliminating rivals one by one. Stalin moved cautiously at first, masking his ambition with loyalty. He built alliances, controlled party bureaucracy, and quietly stacked the Communist Party with supporters. Then, as rivals underestimated him, he struck. Trotsky was exiled, then assassinated. Others were purged, imprisoned, or executed. By the early 1930s, Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into his personal empire. But it was not enough to rule. He demanded absolute control. His policies of forced collectivization starved millions in the Ukrainian famine. His Great Purge filled prisons and gulags with generals, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens accused of treason. The air itself seemed dangerous. Neighbors informed on neighbors, children denounced parents, and fear became the heartbeat of Stalin's rule. Yet amid the terror, Stalin also transformed the Soviet Union into a military and industrial power. He dragged a backward nation into the modern age, but at a price written in blood. When Hitler invaded in 1941, it was Stalin's brutal determination that held the Soviet line and eventually crushed the Nazi war machine. Stalin rose from the shadows of Lenin's revolution, not with charisma, but with cold-blooded calculation. His legacy is a paradox, a leader who saved his nation by terrifying it and who proved that in the game of power, ruthlessness is often the final weapon. China in the early 20th century was a fractured land. The Qing dynasty had fallen, but no strong government replaced it. Warlords carved up the country, foreign powers claimed influence, and famine haunted the countryside. Out of this chaos, a revolutionary peasant intellectual named Mao Zedong rose, not by avoiding war, but by embracing it as the engine of power. Mao's early years were marked by guerrilla struggles against both warlords and rival factions. When Japan invaded China in the 1930s, Mao turned the fight into an opportunity. His long march, a grueling 6,000-mile retreat across mountains and rivers, was less a defeat than a legend, solidifying Mao's image as a leader of unbreakable will. To him, chaos was not a setback, it was fuel. In 1949, after decades of conflict, Mao's Communist Party triumphed in the Chinese Civil War. The People's Republic of China was born, and Mao stood as its founding father. But the utopia he promised came at a staggering cost. His great leap forward attempted to modernize China overnight, but instead caused one of the worst famines in human history, killing tens of millions. Later, the Cultural Revolution unleashed chaos yet again. Students turned into zealots, intellectuals beaten, and ancient traditions destroyed. Mao ruled through fear, devotion, and constant upheaval. He believed revolution must never end, that society should always be remade through struggle. Millions perished, yet millions also hailed him as the man who gave China unity and power after a century of humiliation. Mao rose from chaos not as a stabilizer, but as a master of it. He turned war, suffering, and disorder into tools and forged a nation that would never be the same. Spain in the 1930s was a nation tearing itself apart. Poverty, political division, and rising extremism split the country between left-wing Republicans and right-wing nationalists. Street violence escalated into a full-blown civil war in 1936, turning Spain into a bloody battlefield and into the stage for the rise of Franco, a general whose cold discipline and ruthless ambition would define Spain for nearly 4 decades. Franco did not seek compromise. He sought victory at any cost. With support from Hitler and Mussolini, he rallied nationalists, turning Spain's internal conflict into a brutal war of ideology. Cities were bombed, villages burned, and prisoners executed. Nowhere was the ruthlessness clearer than in the destruction of Guernica, immortalized by Picasso, where civilians were slaughtered as a warning to all who resisted. By 1939, Franco had crushed the Republicans and declared himself Spain's leader. His rule was built on repression. Thousands of opponents were executed, imprisoned, or exiled. Spain became a nation where dissent was dangerous, speech was censored, and fear hung in the air like smoke after battle. Yet Franco also brought a kind of grim stability. While the rest of Europe plunged into World War II, Spain stayed neutral, scarred but intact under his iron fist. Franco's dictatorship endured until his death in 1975. To some, he saved Spain from communism. To others, he shackled it in darkness for nearly 40 years. His rise from the chaos of civil war proved that in times of bitter division, the strongest hand, however merciless, often seizes the reins. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, once mighty, now sick and fractured, lay in ruins. Allied forces carved up its territory, foreign troops marched into Istanbul, and many believed Turkey itself would disappear. Out of this collapse rose a soldier-statesman who refused to watch his homeland die. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk would save Turkey, but not gently. His vision required breaking the old world to build a new one. Atatürk rallied nationalist forces during the Turkish War of Independence, defeating occupying powers and abolishing the Ottoman Sultanate. He was hailed as a liberator, but liberation was only the beginning. His true mission was to drag Turkey into modernity, and he pursued it with iron resolve. Atatürk banned the fez, abolished Islamic courts, and replaced Arabic script with Latin letters. He closed religious schools, granted women the right to vote, and imposed sweeping secular reforms. But where tradition resisted, he did not hesitate to crush it. Dissenters were jailed or executed. Religious leaders were silenced. His modernization campaign was as ruthless as it was revolutionary, yet his ruthlessness forged results. Turkey transformed from a dying empire into a secular republic, aligned with Western ideals of progress. His legacy is complicated. To some, he is the father of modern Turkey, a visionary who gave his nation a future. To others, he was a dictator who trampled culture and faith in the name of change. Atatürk rose from the Ottoman collapse not by preserving the past, but by obliterating it. He proved that chaos can create not just destroyers, but reformers whose ruthless determination reshapes a nation's destiny. History teaches us that chaos is not just destruction, it is a crucible, a forge in which nations either shatter or are reshaped by those bold enough and ruthless enough to seize control. The 7 men we have explored did not emerge in times of peace and stability. They rose from hunger, humiliation, civil war, and collapse. For them, chaos was not a threat. It was an opportunity. Lenin turned a starving empire into a revolutionary state. Hitler transformed national humiliation into fanaticism. Mussolini used fear and violence to replace democracy with dictatorship. Stalin bent an entire nation through terror. Mao embraced endless struggle to forge a new China. Franco imposed order on Spain through repression. And Atatürk, though admired for reform, wielded ruthlessness to rebuild Turkey from the ashes of empire. Their stories remind us of a chilling truth. When societies collapse, people do not always choose the kindest leader. They choose the strongest voice, the one who promises order, pride, or survival, even if the cost is freedom, blood, or truth itself. The lesson is sobering. Chaos will always return in one form or another, and when it does, history warns us to be ready for the next ruthless leader waiting in the shadows.